different in their knowledge of technology, how to modify for online learning. And so this has been a really challenging learning time for all of us. I am still optimistic and hopeful that at the end of the day, we're going to say, hey, we really learned a lot. We learned how to do this. And I'll tell you, Total Learning Centers I had, and people have heard me say this, a lot of head trash, that if I can't be in front of a student, I can't really make the difference that I want to. Well, I think that that was head trash. I think there are ways to be able to make a difference. The more complicated our kiddos become. And there may be different techniques and different ways of looking at it. So I've heard from a lot of parents, how do I do this? How do I modify this? Ooh, this is not working. Actually, anxiety, which should be better since they're at home, has gotten worse. So how do we deal with all of this? I reached out to a number of people that I know who are involved in this and said, what do you think? How do we do it? How do we help parents? And I don't think there are any of us with all the answers. Too bad. I do want to remind you, we're all trying. Our teachers are trying, our schools are trying, our parents are trying, and most importantly, our students are trying to make this work. Okay, knowing all of that, let's look and let's use our collective wisdom and let's see if we can get some ideas of more things to try, some alternative ways to meet our students' needs. Nancy Scott Potter, and I'm going to get her to talk about some of her background and her the firm that she works with, and she's a fascinating woman. I think you'll really enjoy her. She's going to talk about what we really should be prioritizing, asking for, what some of the terms mean. Have timelines changed? Or do we still have IEP meetings? Do we still do testing? How can we help our students best? And we all know that each child is individual. There's no one answer that will meet all of our students' needs. But we're hoping that we can begin peeling that onion, start figuring it out, and making sure that for our students, especially for those students that are behind, we are not losing 25% of the year. That maybe we can use this time of the year even more effectively and accelerate progress. And I believe there are some ways for some of our students that we can do that. Okay, a couple of housekeeping things. Nancy, thank you so much for doing this, Nancy, and for keeping us all organized. She has everyone muted except for, I believe, JT and I are unmuted in case we pop in for some educators' thoughts on how to maybe address a specific issue. We also, if you'll notice, if you haven't used Zoom before, there is a chat feature. And the nice thing about the chat feature is as you're going through and you think of questions, that's a perfect place to have them. I told Nancy I would keep an eye on the chat and so that she doesn't have to split her attention. And I will share with her, text her questions as they occur and as she can get to it. Thank you all for the ones who had questions and shared them with us initially. Nancy has those questions. She's going to try and address as many of those during the time that we have allotted as possible. And if we don't get to your question, JT, Nancy, and I have made the offer that if you'll just let us know, we'll make sure and talk to you offline and try and get you some answers for your students. So thanks for being here with us. And Nancy, tell them a little about yourself and then let's zoom right in.
Great. Well, thank you again so much to Dr. Carol and her team for collaborating on this. My favorite thing to do is sit down with parents and a big cup of coffee and try to figure out solutions for our kids together. So thank you. I am with a law firm called McAndrews Law Offices. We just opened up in Pittsburgh last summer. I was previously at the Office for Civil Rights with the U.S. Department of Education, where I was leading a team investigating allegations of discrimination against students by schools around the country. And Dennis McAndrews, the founder of our firm, reached out to me, and he knew that I had come to Philadelphia from Pittsburgh. I was here at Kids Voice and the Education Law Center before I was called to go serve in a federal capacity for the U.S. Department of Ed in Philly. And he knew I wanted to come back, and he was interested in opening a firm here. So I opened our 7th office out here in Pittsburgh last summer. I'm seeing some familiar names in the list, so I know some of you know my wonderful colleague, Jillian Zacks, and we're kind of what we call like the 2 lungs of this work with families and vulnerable students. So I do education civil rights work, and I very passionately believe that's what it is. So that includes special education work, protecting students from discrimination under Section 504 and their rights under the IDEA. We'll talk more about what those things are. But I also do Title IX, Title VI, school discipline, student enrollment. If there's a kid out there who wants to go to school, whether they're 3 months old or 35, I help those students make sure they get to go to school and get what they need to be there. And Jillian does estates and trusts and special needs planning work. So we think that we have a really wonderful collaborative practice, and we're able to serve families really well. My background otherwise is, this is my work. I went to law school because I wanted to do student rights, and that's what I'm doing, and I feel really privileged and lucky to do that. Okay. I do want to just let everyone know that I am being recorded. We're recording this session. If you have questions you want to ask, like Dr. Carol said, you can type those into the chat. Anyone who asks a question, I'm not going to say your name to try to protect if you have any, if you want to keep that confidentiality. I'll say in general what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some frequently asked questions. These are questions that you all sent in. There's a lot of overlap. So the ones that are kind of across the board seem to be questions that people have. I'm going to do those. And then I'll go through and do some other individual questions as we have time. In general, I'll say that like really specific things about your particular family, child, student, or self, we may not get to those, and you may not be comfortable sharing all that personal information here with everyone. And so I do want to let you know that, and I know this is true for Dr. Carol's team as well, I provide free consultations always, almost always. I represent families, especially in IDEA issues, at no cost to the family. So I can talk a little bit more. There's some questions that came in about that later about what that means. But this isn't your only shot to ask myself or Dr. Carol and her team a question. I hope you see both of us as resources, and that this is just the beginning of a conversation. So with that said, I am going to start on my frequently asked questions. I do want to note that Total Learning Centers has a really wonderful blog. They do their own blogging. They also bring in guest bloggers about education information on their website, totallearningcenters.com. And if you go there and go to the blog, you will see that I shared my notes for today's call there. So don't feel like you have to write everything down or like this is your last chance to hear this information. It's all written down there for your convenience. So the first question we get a lot so far has been, do school districts still have to provide FAPE? Do they have to have IEP meetings? What's going on with evaluation timelines? So very early on, the US Department of Education gave us guidance on March 12th that said if a school district is closed and not providing direct instruction to any student, those school districts had no obligation to provide FAPE. However, if a school was providing instruction to students during the school closure, they needed to provide instruction to all students, including the provision of FAPE to eligibles. Now, very quickly, we all figured out that this was going to last much longer than just a couple of weeks. And so the Department of Ed then put out further guidance on March 22nd that was much more helpful, saying school districts, you can't just not provide services to all students because you've decided that FAPE is an impediment or is going to, make some possible liability. Like, you have to educate students, and students with disabilities are still entitled to their rights. So I'm going to use some alphabet soup here. And before I dive into more of this question, let me talk a little bit about what that alphabet soup is. So the first thing we're going to talk a lot about is the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. That is our federal law that gives students with disabilities a right to special education and lays out how special education is supposed to work. Each state, including, most of you are from Pennsylvania, so I'll focus on that, including Pennsylvania, have their own special education laws and regulations implementing the IDEA, but we'll talk about the IDEA when we talk about those rights. FAPE is what is the big piece of the IDEA that it guarantees students. FAPE is free and appropriate public education. So that's what our students are entitled to. And the other thing we'll talk about is ESY, extended school year. So if you hear me use some alphabet soup and you're not sure what it is, I will apologize up front for falling into that trap and just ask you to pop a question into the chat and we'll make sure to address that. Okay, so we know the students are still obligated, schools are still obligated to provide students FAPE. What about timelines? Timelines have not been waived. So timelines for the completion of evaluations, reevaluations, and IEPs at this time have not been waived. They should be completed consistent with timelines contained in state and federal regulations. Now, there's certainly certain testing that cannot be administered virtually or remotely. Of course, classroom observations probably cannot be completed during the period of school closures. But there's a lot of things that can be done. Evaluators can review student records, available progress data. They can interview parents, teachers, students. They can administer rating scales and certain other assessments. What we are encouraging our clients to do, which I think is a very pragmatic, practical standpoint, is to say, district, school, I'm flexible. I know that you're in a rough spot, we're in a rough spot, but we still need to have some sort of forward movement. So we're asking and encouraging clients to ask districts if they can issue an interim evaluation or reevaluation based on those types of information I just mentioned that can be done without one-to-one personal interaction, with the commitment that they will complete other testing and observations once schools or even just the society reopens, and then issue an amended report. Of course, IEP meetings can still be held, should still be held, and those can be done remotely via telephone or video conference. A school cannot force you to participate by video conference. For some families, that can be a challenge for various reasons. So I do want to make clear, like, you can always participate in those meetings by phone. Okay. The last thing I'll say about the evaluations is that in my experience, the past couple of months, some evaluators are very willing to figure out creative solutions on how to do evaluations remotely or to do these interim evaluation reports with the commitment to issue a full report once we're able to be in the same room again. So sometimes it's just pushing a little bit back to say, let's think outside the box, let's be creative. It's certainly more challenging for students who have not yet been identified. So students who this is their first evaluation for special education, a student maybe who needs an occupational therapy evaluation who's never had one before, those are much more challenging to get any sort of an interim assessment on, and understandably. But there are creative solutions out there, and I just encourage you to, to think outside the box and to ask your school to engage in that with you. What about students who get Section 504 services? So, like I said, the IDEA is the law that gives us special education, but the actual civil rights law that protects students with disabilities from discrimination is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And some students who are not eligible for special education services still are eligible for services under a Section 504 plan, which basically just makes sure that education is accessible to them through some reasonable accommodation. So similar to students under the IDEA, similar to students getting an IEP, 504 plans should still be implemented. They should still have their accommodations, these students should. Related services for some students, occupational therapy, physical therapy, those are sometimes provided through a 504 plan, should still be provided. Accommodations like extended testing time, frequent breaks, maybe your child gets enlarged prep materials, those things should also be provided. For any of you who have students currently or maybe in the future will be going to post-secondary, it's important to remember whether that post-secondary institution is a major research university, a community college, a career and technical education setting, whatever that post-secondary education is, students, while they lose those IDEA rights when they move into higher ed, keep their 504 rights. Those protect all students. So, if you have a student who's starting post-secondary in the fall, they still should be reaching out to the Disability Services Office and asking for what those related services look like. Whether it is a student who is under the IDEA or Section 504, I do want to encourage you that if there's issues coming up that are unique to distance learning or online learning that they need some accommodations for, ask for those. Call an IEP meeting, call a Section 504 meeting, and say, you know what, all this screen time is really hard on my student who, perhaps has a 504 plan because of a series of concussions. So maybe we need to tweak that 504 plan, or maybe we need to add some accommodations into our IEP that aren't necessary in a regular brick and mortar classroom, but are certainly necessary in the current situation we're in. We received quite a few questions about vocational CTE, that's career and technical education, what we used to call VOTEX, and work-based programming. Students who are receiving those, certainly remote-based learning can be more challenging, especially if there's certain aspects of a student's program that can only be implemented, in the actual setting that's closed at this time. I have students who maybe are in a mechanics program, but to the extent possible, anything that can be provided virtually should be done so. Instruction remotely should continue, and any sort of accommodations or supports they're getting through an IEP or a 504 plan should. This is a really big one to me. This is something that I think is very underserved. So, can I request parent training? Number one, the answer to that is always yes. So in my opinion, parent training is a related service under the IDEA that is very underutilized. What is parent training? Basically, the school district provides training to parents to assist them in meeting their child's educational. That training can be provided by the child's teacher, another teacher, a different educator. It may be a professional or a paraprofessional from the school, and can include instruction on a variety of academic, functional, and behavior techniques that can benefit a child. Parent training can also include direct consultation with you regarding your specific child. So let's say maybe it may be an assistive technology issue. Your child uses a screen reader. Now that you're at home and trying to use it with Zoom and new technology and Google Classroom, you don't know how to do that. You can request parent training. Someone from the school can walk you through over the phone, over video, whatever, training you how to utilize that assistive technology. But similarly, they could provide parent trainings on behavioral techniques or reading techniques or instruction that's happening at the school as part of your student's IEP that can now happen here. And Dr. Carroll just sent me a question from someone that they asked for an accommodation but told no because it's all synchronized. You know, I sometimes break the speed limit, right? So the law says I have to drive under a certain mile per hour. I have a little bit of a lead foot, so I tend to break that law. Similarly, with the IDEA, as you all know, we have these laws in place that say you have to give accommodations. You can't make blanket statements. They have to be individualized for each student. That doesn't mean that that always happens, right? That's why I have a job, is because not everyone always follows the law, unfortunately. So I'm going to go over a little bit later about how to respond when the school district pushes back. And there's certainly districts that don't have devices for all students or don't have internet access for all students. You know, I think that the focus has to be on the student that is in front of you and what they're working with. And if you have a student, if your child doesn't have internet access and needs access to internet to be able to engage in their education, and that's not something you can provide, then you should be asking the school to provide that as a related service. Okay, counseling services. We've got lots of questions from parents saying, you know, counseling services, I think my child might even need more. What happens? How do these continue? You know, telemedicine and teletherapy has been going on for a long time. Many therapists and counselors are comfortable with that mode. The amount of therapy may remain consistent, but under certain circumstances like these, there could be reasons why we need to increase the services. There may also be reasons why you may want to decrease counseling services for your student. So any increase or decrease in those services should be a decision made by the student's IEP team, but counseling services are definitely something that should be continued in this world of online learning. Incarcerated youth. So, you know, we work with a lot of advocates and do lots of training for organizations and agencies, many of whom work with students who are incarcerated. In general, the IDEA has some pretty narrow modifications for student rights for those students who are incarcerated. But the important thing is that, yes, these students, if they are still incarcerated, are absolutely still entitled to their educational rights. Maybe there's safety concerns at a jail or a prison facility or a juvenile delinquency center that makes, they're saying, well, we can't get teachers in, we have all these safety things. Well, the fact is that video conferencing software has been used by juvenile centers, by jails, by prisons for about a decade at this point for court appearances. So they have the technology there. And if you're an advocate working with a student or a parent of a student who's in one of those facilities, you know, we would just continue to encourage you to push them to remember they already have this technology, and it's absolutely not allowed for them to just put off education because of other safety protocols that are going on. Okay, I'm just going to take a little break and look at the questions that have been asked and see if there's anything coming up, or if these are kind of unique and outside what I'm answering here. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit later about what we included in NORUPs. 504. Dr. Carroll, I have you unmuted, so I think you must have muted yourself. There you go. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Ooh, I don't like not being able to talk. That was not so much fun. I had a couple of quick questions. You talked about an interim evaluation. Is that a legal term? I've never heard of. We used to use long time ago, oh gosh, I'm going to show my age, thought to be special ed student, is that along the same line? So tell me.
So, I mean, thought to be is still certain students who are thought to be eligible still have the same protections as students who are eligible. So that is still certainly the case. The interim reports, are they a legal term? I don't think you're going to find it necessarily in a regulation, but it is certainly the case that schools have always been able, and parents have always been able to ask for an evaluator to issue an interim report when they feel like services are immediately necessary or something's going on that's immediately needs to be addressed. But you know, our experience has been thus far that this is a creative, out-of-the-box solution that many schools and evaluators are willing to do, to say, okay, even though I can't get in and do one-to-one classroom observations, which is really necessary to give a full evaluation, based on the students' records, the written feedback I've gotten from teachers, interviews I've done with the parent, the teachers, and the students, it's really clear that this student needs XYZ in order to get the FAPE that they're entitled to. So let's go ahead and get those things implemented via this interim report. And we're all going to sign the report and agree that we're going to get back together once I, evaluator, am able to complete the full evaluation and see what else the student
needs. And I will tell you, I would not have thought it's possible OT, PT, counseling through video, chatting, and phone. We've had a lot of success. So I've completely changed my mind. And we've found that it is working and we're making progress. And so I would encourage you, if you have related services, so we're doing speech, OT, PT, and counseling, no issues.
Yeah, I've been really, I mean, so long as the family and students have, you know, the technology to be able to access it, I've been really impressed with how those professionals have been meeting the needs of students. So speaking of evaluations, people have asked also, well, are the evaluations that aren't done face-to-face going to be valid? So I break that down into 4 different categories of what assessment looks like in the social distancing world. So the first part is data review. Data review, of course, can be conducted remotely. All assessments under the IDEA are supposed to start with data review, and therefore all evaluations during shutdowns can and should still include this component. The fact is that the State Department of Education in Pennsylvania requires electronic record keeping from our school districts. Schools should have almost all, if not all, of the data in some sort of an electronic form that's easily accessible for administrators and teachers to be able to share with evaluators. The second grouping is rating scales. So if you haven't done this before, many assessments include rating scales. Parents, teachers, and students complete a rating scale that lets you know like their personal assessment of the students, whatever it is we're assessing. Many assessments include rating scales by teachers, by teachers, parents, and students. They can almost always be completed remotely, with the caveat that some scales are based on the rater's knowledge of the child for the past month. If that's the case and a teacher completes a scale more than 1 month since they've seen the student physically, especially if the teacher does not have remote contact with the student, you just want to make sure the report notes that could be a deviation from standard administration, and you may want to get updated scales, a month into the next school year.
I'll also share, and I think one of the things that I get to do is some of the things, we've tried this and it works. We've talked to the different companies that produce the tests and have standardized them, and generally they can be appropriately done distance learning or face-to-face, except for the ones that require manipulatives. So part of the IQ test where we manipulate blocks, we're delaying that piece until we can be face-to-face again. But we're really amazed at how much can be done. And with testing, none of it is truly black and white. It always requires the skill and art of the evaluator. And so, your evaluator should be able to tell you, no, this is not a good measure of this child. And then, okay, maybe this is a kid we do have to see face to face. But you can get a lot of data. And I think some of the interesting things that you can figure out is how this child does during distance learning. So it gives good information regardless.
Absolutely. Okay. The next bucket of assessments are assessments that can be completed over video conferencing software. So published, just like Dr. Carol was saying, publishers, school psychology groups, others have been promulgating guidance for their practitioners about how to administer assessments over video. Of course, the appropriateness of the assessment depends on students, measures, testing conditions, and whether they can actually establish a rapport. But of course, if anything's measured this way or assessed this way, it should be noted in the report.
Absolutely. And I did get a question that said, so they asked for me to repeat if we've been told by the test authors of the assessment, the companies that make the assessments, whether or not everything except the ones that require manipulatives could be done online, distance learning. And I'll tell you, that's just way too broad of a statement. I wish I had spoken to every manufacturer of every testing. However, we did talk to the people who produce the IQ testing. We did talk to achievement testing. We did look at memory testing and executive functioning, speech and language, and all of them already have ways to do the testing. But again, if you're not getting good results from a kid, you need to say that, because the trained person working with a child is what is really important. There are a lot of concerns that will a child need someone to keep them focused? Maybe. Will parents prompt their child? Yeah, if you tell them, unless you tell them not to, then they could. Parents like to help kids, but it's the same issues that teachers have. So I believe a lot of this can be taken care of, and at least it'll give us enough information to make plans for a child, to get data, and that to us is what's really important. We're concerned about even post-testing for our kids after the school year. We have so many parents who are concerned about math. Have they made enough progress in math to consider this year of math closed? Well, great question. And that is definitely something through achievement testing you can do.
So then the last piece of assessments are assessments that cannot be administered any way other than a face-to-face testing arrangement. If an assessment like that is needed, as I talked about earlier, parents, schools, and evaluators should discuss the relative merits of either issuing a partial report followed later by an addendum once schools or testing is able to reopen, or postponing a report. We encourage, like I said earlier, leaning toward the former, as it gives the IEP team as much information as possible as soon as possible. We think that could be particularly useful in programming for a student in these very new circumstances. But the fact is, there are situations when an evaluator does not have sufficient information to make recommendations and findings and does need to wait until face-to-face testing is completed. And like I said earlier, any of the assessments in those first three groupings will be valid. The question is whether or not they'll give sufficient information to program for the child. And if they don't, then additional testing should be completed when schools or communities reopen. Okay, so this is some of the questions we're getting right now, and certainly big questions. Oh, this is so nice, Nancy. Thanks for telling us all these best practices. So what am I supposed to do when somebody tells me no? And that's certainly happening, and it will happen. And, I think everyone is just grappling with how to do this. So districts should, of course, be working to provide as close to comparable services as possible via remote means. If a service can be produced via video chat, teletherapy, phone calls, districts should strive to provide it. If the district does say no, these are the steps that we would recommend. Number one, ask questions and ask them in writing. Okay, so what if we did try a phone check-in? Well, I know other districts are providing video chat speech therapy. Can we try that? Ask lots of questions. What's the hurdle? What's the boundary? What's the reason we can't make this happen? Can we think of some creative out-of-the-box solutions? Always respectfully note your disagreement. Something like, it looks like we're going to have to agree to disagree, but I'd appreciate if you could note my disagreement in the meeting notes or following up with an email afterwards. And then working your way up the food chain, so to speak. If you're not getting anywhere with your classroom teacher, contact the special education coordinator or similar position at your school, and then the special ed director. Sometimes those changes and decisions are more easily made with those individuals who work closer with the student, but sometimes it's more systemic and you got to push up the food chain, so to speak. We always encourage clients to be respectful, to be flexible, but also make clear that you know what your child's needs are. If the district continues to refuse services that you feel are possible, continue to make notes about it, make sure that you keep track of that, and when schools do reopen in that first IEP meeting back, you can talk about compensatory services at that point. The other thing I would say is if people keep saying no to you, email us or someone like us who can help you walk through what some next steps are and how to get things legally enforceable. So I just mentioned compensatory services or compensatory education. I want to make sure that everyone knows what that is. Again, under the IDEA, this law that gives our students the right to FAPE, it says when students are denied a FAPE, that the school has to repay them for what they miss in compensatory education. So if you're not familiar with that, that doesn't mean that the school just writes you a check and says, oh, sorry, here's $500 to make up for those 10 hours of instruction that was missed. But it's sometimes in the form of a compensatory education fund that you can use specifically to pay for education services to replace what is lost. It's also sometimes in services. So if I have a student who over the past month has missed out on 10 hours of speech therapy, the school is going to agree that over the next 2 months, the student will get compensatory speech therapy in the form of 10 additional hours to what they should already. The U.S. Department of Ed has said that when schools reopen, districts have to make an individualized determination whether and to what extent compensatory services may be needed, including to make up for any school skill that may have been lost. We don't have much more guidance about what those determinations look like. We believe that districts will be expected to hold IEP meetings when schools reopen, and at those meetings offer additional education services to make up for any services not provided. They should be offered as an increase in services, or less likely, but like I said, a compensatory education fund. And let me, while we're just at this point, note, and we've gotten lots of questions about this. Okay, so progress monitoring. Who's monitoring the progress? Who's monitoring what's going on with my student? I saw someone say that schools have told me that they can't monitor goals or progress. There have been no waivers for progress monitoring. So in general, yes, schools absolutely still have to follow those requirements of progress monitoring. And how they do that is in a variety of ways, whether it's evaluating progress monitoring through assignments that are turned in, through maybe a questionnaire or survey from the parent. There's a variety of ways to do that. The school should be doing it. I would certainly demand it. But the other piece is really at this point and this time, we're encouraging our clients and parents to do their own progress monitoring. Now, I don't mean progress monitoring with a big P and M. It doesn't have to be something very formal. It doesn't have to be a perfect Excel spreadsheet. I have some families that just keep a notebook on the kitchen counter. And at the end of the week, write down, oh, I've noticed that Jerry has really regressed in his R articulation since school's been out. I've noticed that behaviorally this is going on. Both the positives and the negatives, just your own as a parent observations of what's going on from a progress monitoring standpoint. And also noting some specifics when you can. Should have had 3 hours of OT this week, got 0. That's helpful too. I have another family that has a dry erase board on their refrigerator. And she just jots down notes, and whenever the dry erase board gets full, she takes a picture of it and emails me that picture of her progress monitoring notes. So there's a variety of ways to do it. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. It does not have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be technical. You parents, and I am a students' rights person, so I say and student, are the most important people on that IEP team. You are the experts. And I want to just empower you to say that whatever you're noticing, whatever progress or lack thereof you're monitoring, however you document that is the right way. Okay. What in the world is going on with ESY? So like I said earlier, ESY stands for Extended School Year. Students who show regression over school breaks are oftentimes entitled to an extended school year service. We usually think of that, I think, as summer school, though extended school year can actually mean before, after school tutoring, weekend support. It can mean support over other school breaks besides just summer break. But that's what ESY is. What we know right now in Pennsylvania is that Governor Wolf has said camps and schools are not allowed to open before June 20th. So if there's going to be any ESY or anything like that, it's going to happen. Physical ESY, it's going to have to happen after June 20th. However, there are many ESY programs that we're seeing come up virtually. So for example, if your student's big regression is in executive functioning skills, we see lots of places that are doing ESY virtually around executive functioning skills. I'm sure Total Learning Centers and Dr. Carroll can provide ESY services virtually as we reach that point. So if your school's not going to provide any sort of online or virtual ESY, or what they're providing isn't appropriate for your student, search out those private providers. And I'm sure Dr. Carroll and myself can help you find those if you need to. If schools were able to reopen this summer, students may see standard ESY services, or some schools are talking about using summertime to make up instructional time for the full student body. We can see schools try to use this time to deliver some of the compensatory services that we talked about earlier. And ESY summer services may be less relevant this summer, but for students who experience those significant regressions during closures, we definitely want parents talking to districts about extended school year services throughout the school year over shorter breaks to help those students regain that lost ground. And then the last thing that I have in my my prepared frequently asked questions, and then I'll look more at our individual questions that we've received, is about what do I say if I get a NORA notice of, sorry, I'm just looking, Dr. Carroll just sent me a question. I want to make sure I know it. Great question about ESY. I'm just going to back up really fast and do that. If you did not qualify for extended school year before COVID, can you request ESY because of loss of skills education during COVID? You can definitely request it. Whether or not the student will be found eligible or the school will grant it, that's debatable. But the way to request that and to make that request stronger is, again, to be noting those regressions, to have in place your own records of here, these huge regressions are happening. He wasn't found eligible for ESY. I think that he is eligible or should have been eligible, but is certainly eligible now. The other thing though is if you're seeing those big regressions and they're not, and your child's not eligible for ESY, that's another spot where you say, okay, we're not eligible for ESY this summer. We would like compensatory services this summer then to make up for the regression that they've experienced during COVID. So you kind of have two avenues to help your student there. Okay, so make sure any NORA any waiver, anything you get from the school district you receive indicates that the plan for distance learning is, these are kind of my magic words, temporary. It is an interim plan, and that your student's program will revert back to the last IEP in NORUP when schools reopen. You want to be on the lookout for any indication that the district regards your agreement to the new NORUP as a waiver of your child's right to FAPE. They might say FAPE, they might say free or appropriate public education during this time. If you see anything concerning along those lines, but you want to move forward with implementing the distance learning plan or receiving some distance learning services, then we recommend that you sign the document, but write with your signature, I agree to the implementation of this distance learning plan, but not to its appropriateness. Okay, so let's dig into some of your questions. What if my child was approved for tutoring this summer? If the school reopens, can I require the service be provided at home? Yes, if your child's been approved for 10 hours of at-home tutoring, which is what it sounds like, then that should be what they receive. It shouldn't be, you know, pulled back away from you. It looks like that's what the agreement is, and I would say continue on with that. Okay, let me get to some of the questions that we had emailed into us. What should I do if I do not agree with online services that my district is pushing out to my child? Again, document, document, document. Via email, say what you don't agree with, say what your problems are. And if the online services that are being pushed out are not, you know, meeting your needs, call an IEP meeting. Figure out if they're saying, look, this is just what we're sending out to everybody. This is what all students are getting. This is what your student has to do. You know, that's not individualized the way it's supposed to be under the IDEA. So ask for an IEP meeting, and then in the IEP meeting say, I want to discuss, you know, what supports or programming or accommodations or changes we need to do to make my child successful right now. What should I make sure is included in my COVID IEP? You know, make sure whatever is included is what you need. Like I said before, I think parent training is a huge piece that we're not seeing in our IEPs that could definitely be included. But you want to ask in any sort of updated IEP or any sort of distance learning plan related IEP amendments that you're asking for whatever services and programming you think would help things in your house go more smoothly. And quite frankly, if you don't know what that answer is, because I can tell you, someone educating my two very young children in my home right now, I don't know those answers. You know, you need an IEP meeting to get the IEP team together to ask, what do you guys think? What are some best practices? What are you hearing? Can we come up with some out of the box ideas here? And then again, data collection questions. Yes, parents, collect data on your students, and don't think of the words collect data as meaning some scientific, special, sophisticated thing. Couple notes from you, an email to yourself, a picture of a dry erase board, whatever that is. You just keeping those contemporaneous records of what's going on for your child are really going to be helpful in trying to, you know, address whatever losses happen during this time.
You know, I want to mention a lot of parents, because of the new rule that they can call their special ed IEP coordinator and make a quick change, they've kind of gotten used to that. And so they don't pull the whole team together. Well, if you're not getting it figured out just between the two of you, I think this is a very appropriate time to call the rest of the brain trust, your child's IEP team together to get some of this figured out. You know, I started out saying, we're all people. We're all trying to get this figured out. We're all under varying degrees of stress during this time. And so, and some of us have figured out a few pieces and some other pieces. This is the time, if you're not getting there, if it's not working, you're trying what the teacher recommends, it's okay. Get your special ed director involved, get other people who know your child involved, and do it open, without being mad at each other. Let's just talk together and see if we can't figure out some ideas to get our kids more successful. And so don't just, you ask, they said no, you're not done. You're not done. This is an okay, maybe it's a no, maybe what you're asking for doesn't work, but let's figure out a way to get to that goal. And all the goal is to help our kids be more successful.
We had some questions about what social skills opportunities should be available. My understanding is some districts are hosting these online Zoom social skills groups. Maybe ask if that's something that's available, if you think it would work well for your child. It doesn't work well for everyone. I can tell you that my 6-year-old, it does not work well for him, the Zooming. Every time we get on Zoom, he bursts into tears and says, "This is weird, I miss my friends, this is so hard." So that doesn't mean it's gonna work for everyone, but that is one option that I'm seeing going on with social skills. For those of you who feel like that, like your child needs some live interactive instruction, and recorded video is not working for you, and I hear you, somebody said, my days include tears and frustration. Mine too. I think reaching out to, again, that brain trust, I love that, Dr. Kara, I'm totally stealing it. That IEP team, the teachers, and in writing an email and saying, like, I know this is really hard for everyone, but my child's not getting what she needs right now pursuant to her IEP. Can we figure out a way to fix this, or figure out a way to make it a little better? I know for my younger child, the Zoom meetings he can't function in them. And so his teacher did agree that once a week, and it's really just for 15 minutes, but it makes a huge difference for him. He has a one-on-one check-in with her.
And I think those one-on-one check-ins can make really the difference between that success and failure. And for some of us, whatever we practice is what we get better at. So when we first started doing social things, social meetings online, it was not successful at all. But we've moved to the point where some of the students are having lunch together and just talking and taking turns, and it is working. So you start with where the child is at, just like we do with all the academics, and help them move further along the way.
We got lots of questions from parents about, I don't feel like what's in my IEP is working right now. Can I dispute the IEP? Can I ask for more academics? Can I ask for an IEP meeting? Are we going to have IEP meetings? And the answer to all of that is yes. If your IEP is not working for your student right now in the current situation, you can absolutely ask for an IEP meeting. And IEP meetings should be happening. They should be happening virtually or by phone. But just because we can't all get together in a big room with each other is no reason for IEP meetings not to happen. What happens if both parents work during the day to try to participate in a meeting? I know that's really hard. I'm a single mom with 2 little boys, and so many of those things happen during the school day. I would say 2 things. Number one is, if you work at an employer who's covered by the FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, it was amended this year through regulation and guidance to say that you can use FMLA time for IEP meetings, which is a really big deal. But just like with scheduling IEP meetings in non-COVID time, work with the school, see if you can do something outside the regular school day. But oftentimes it is such a burden on working parents, I know, but it's the only time that they can take place. Lots of questions about what compensatory education will school districts be responsible for. Like I said, the U.S. Department of Ed and the Pennsylvania Department of Ed have both made it clear that schools are going to be, responsible for comp ed, and how much really depends on the child and what's going on with that particular child, and that's why keeping track of that progress monitoring or whatever you want to call it, but keeping your kind of weekly notes on what's going on with your students can be helpful. Then we had some questions specifically about kind of how legal representation works, and then some other questions specifically about how best practices for delivering instruction. So I think what I'll do is I'll wrap up by talking about legal representation very shortly, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Carol and her team of experts to talk to you about what they're seeing and what they're utilizing and implementing themselves as best practices from like a instructional standpoint. So, you know, every law firm is different, and I have lots of wonderful friends and colleagues who do the same work that I do in other firms, so their answer will be different. So my answer about this is really about what McAndrews does and how I take cases and evaluate cases. So for my firm to accept a case, there's no like strict set of criteria necessarily, but kind of the way it works, or the system for finding out if we would take your case, is you can email me, which my email is now on Dr. Carol's website. It was in the invitation, you all should have it, but it's npotter@mcandrewslaw.com. You email me, and then just some basic information and your phone number. I have an amazing team of paralegals who do my intake. So one of these wonderful, they all happen to be women at this time. So one of these wonderful women will reach out to you, and she'll ask you just a bunch of questions about, you know, history, what's going on, what do you want, what are things going on. She'll ask you for records if you have those available and can share them. And then basically she puts that all together in a file and does a summary for me. And then if it's a case that I think I might maybe 10% at least maybe could help with, which is almost every one of those that come through the door, I do a full review of all the records that we have and set up a meeting with the family. All of this is done at no cost whatsoever to the family. And then I review the records, and I'll give you a strategic plan, what to do more moving forward, what questions you should be asking. And sometimes that plan is, you don't need me. But sometimes the plan is, you know, I think you need legal representation, and here's what it looks like. So when I do take a case, you know, when we become someone's lawyer, we do that through a representation agreement. And that representation agreement says that our firm, we believe that all families should have access to quality legal representation regardless of their ability to pay. And because the IDEA says that if parents need to engage an attorney then to make a change for their student, then the school district has to reimburse for those attorney's fees. So for our firm, instead of having you pay us and you get reimbursed, we actually request the attorney's fees directly from the school district. And we take on all that financial risk. So if I take your case and we go through and I'm not successful and we lose, that's on me. That's on our firm. We take that financial risk. We don't go back and ask for you to reimburse us or to pay us back for losing. So that's the way that we do it. Once a lawyer accepts a case and we become your lawyer, how do we approach the school? That really depends. You know, sometimes parents do just have us because they want to consult with us. They don't want us to talk to the school. In those cases, they do pay hourly. But I never reach out to a school and say, taking you to court. You know, I'm always, and all the attorneys in our firm, we're always in contact with our clients, and we make sure you know exactly what we're going to do to move forward, and that that you feel good about that. So that's kind of how it works at McAndrews. If you have a question and you want to know more information, if I can be helpful to you, email is always the best way to get a hold of me, especially right now. And, you know, I welcome those emails. The other thing is I do trainings, I speak all the time for free with parents, with parent groups, students groups, student rights. So if you ever just need somebody to come out and sit down with some parents and have a conversation, I also do free IEP clinics where I'll just sit down for 15 minutes and kind of like 15-minute increments with families to go over their documents and do some quick issue spotting. So I'm always available to do those things with members of our community. All of that said, I will give a big, big thank you to Dr. Carol. Thank you to all of you for your questions. And I really hope this has given you some empowerment and some answers. But I'm very interested to hear from Dr. Carol and her team about what teaching strategies they found to be most helpful in working with students.
Nancy, thank you so much. And I think that reinforced a lot of the things that a number of us thought, but to pull it all together in one place is really helpful. And I'd really encourage everybody, don't let challenges build up. You have something that's going on, talk to your child's teacher, talk to the school, and get it worked out, because I find that those times when things aren't getting done and we're under so much stress anyway, it just makes things more challenging. And then we get to a point where we're not working together. And we have to work together. We have to get it figured out. And I believe at the end of the day, there's really some great ways to do it. I'm going to, if you have more, I know there's people who had to hop off at 12. We have more Zoom meetings. How about that? We're all kind of having lots of fun. Enjoyed having everybody on here. Obviously, it's a hot topic with lots of people reach out, and it made me realize how that, yes, there were a lot of questions with everybody. So I'm hoping this has gotten it a little bit better. JT, since you're one of our wonderful teachers, as well as in charge of the after school Saturday programs, I thought maybe it would be good for everyone to hear from you what you're finding as wins during this time that we didn't expect. Nancy, we might need you to unmute. Once we mute ourselves, we seem to be stuck.
There we go. So yeah, we have been seeing a ton of success, and I don't know success that we thought we would see so quickly with the move to online learning. You know, Nancy asked about instructional best practices. I think one of the best things that any teacher can do is just try and put yourself in the student's shoes. It doesn't work like a classroom. It's infinitely harder to read the room on an online meeting than it is in person, to know if students are paying attention. So I found that even up to juniors and seniors in high school, I'm having to break the instruction into much smaller pieces and do much more frequent check-ins and checks for understanding. I know for myself, if I'm on a Zoom meeting, and I shake a lot if I don't get to talk. So if I have to listen to somebody else for an extended period of time, I know that as an adult who's functioning in a career, I have trouble keeping up with the information flow. I know I'm missing things along the way. That's going to be even harder for students who don't quite have those same skills yet, and even harder than for our students with learning challenges. We need to look at the pieces that we're giving them at one time, I think is the first thing. And also just upping the interactivity without that face-to-face connection. As much as we can get feedback from the students, keeping them on their toes, calling on them individually, or asking them to raise their hand in the chat. Most of these video chat programs have that feature, or responding to a poll, things like that. As much as we can up the interactivity, that seems to be helping a lot. And also, in addition to the chunks of time, not relying only on pre-recorded video, because it is, you know, like I said, just less interactive.
I'm stealing all of this for my next presentation. There will be polls.
Yeah, polls are good. You know, the other thing that I found interesting with some of our older students is if they're on the video chat with their class and they don't have to share their video, we've dropped some social anxiety a little bit. And that was very surprising to me. We have a student that has had lots and lots of anxiety, and unlike most of us whose anxiety has increased, she actually seems to be doing better than she was. And I had to dig in and try and figure it out because it was very cool, but very surprising. And that was one of the things. She can't stand for people to look at her because of her feelings about how she looks. So with the video off, and she's smart and she thinks she sounds okay, that seemed to be a more successful way to do it. I have a young man who always thinks he's having a bad hair day. Well, if you turn off your video, maybe no one knows you're having a bad hair day. So that's been a very interesting situation. You know, just like we do with kids in person, we have to look at all of this individually. What is working individually? What isn't working? And how do we tweak it? JT put together a little booklet for us about online learning and just figuring out a little bit about that. That's available on our website. We're also going to email you tomorrow, the next day, or it might be Monday, a booklet that we did, kind of general information, general tips. They're not really specific to your child, but hopefully as you read and think, oh, that might help my child, it'll spark you to look for an individualized way to help your child achieve in school. You know, with any more individualized questions, feel free to email us or call us, and we'll be glad to try and answer them. Nancy, when we had talked before this, you had mentioned parent training, and I know you talked a little bit about it as we were going through. I think that's really a brilliant part and something we really can use, because our parents are being pulled in to the educational system more than ever. And so what kind of parent trainings have you asked for? How have schools respond? How have parents responded to that?
Or, I mean, I think that overall parents have felt really empowered by it. Like, I can ask, it's okay to say you don't know how to do something, and it's okay to ask. I think that, you know, overall schools have responded really well to it. Some schools are like, I'm not putting that in the IEP, and then we have to remind them that it's a related service under the IDEA. But you know, different types of training. Some of it has been training for some parents who needed training on how to use Zoom and Google Classroom, whatever the resources the school is using to deliver the online learning, to actually have training on that platform itself. Like I said earlier, some of it is about assistive technology. So my child uses assistive technology in the school building. Maybe I know how to use that for my child in like a daily living way, but I don't know how it interacts with schoolwork. So those sorts of things. Some of it has been on, you know, like reading instruction. So, you know, a school, and this happened to me, my child's school sent home these reading assignments. I have a kindergartner who's learning to read. You know, they sent home these reading assignments and called it certain things that I had no idea what they meant. And I've worked with clients who had the same thing, where they're like, this is how to support your kid. But, you know, they don't know that technique. So even learning those techniques, and some of it's general education and some of it's special education. Occupational therapy, physical therapy, I think those things are easier to wrap our heads around, like what that looks like, being trained how to support your student in that. But behavioral techniques too, which sometimes is great because it really overflows outside of the regular school day. You know, what's the best way? You know, I have a client who responds really well to certain types of physical touch. When he's having, you know, it's a stimulation issue. When he's having behavioral issues, certain types of physical touch work really well for him. His teacher has been trained in this. The teacher is now training, and this is a child whose behavioral issues are really only inside of academic instruction and not outside of that. So it's not something the parents had dealt with before, but now they're working on it. Parent training on how to support your child, like I was saying, occupational therapy, how to hold a pencil, like how do I help them with that? So it really is anything that you don't know how to do. You can ask for parent training on that, and it certainly should be part of the IEP.
Had an interesting question. So someone says, oh, good. Can I ask for Wilson training? And that had to be the big fun thing of the day.
I love that. But I would say that you can ask for parent training on how to support your student in the Wilson program while doing distance learning. And we have asked for that, and it has been successful.
And I'd even expand your thinking a little bit more. Wilson is a very specialized program. I'd ask for structured literacy. I'd ask for how do you support your child with reading? And I think that that would be a wonderful thing. JT, you have another idea that you wanted to share.
Yeah, and it actually kind of goes along with another question that we just got about how parents and teachers can include nonverbal students when we have a lot of verbal students interacting. Kind of falls under the same umbrella. You know, I'm naturally a little bit of a pessimist who I worry a lot about things. But, you know, through working with Dr. Carol for a while now, I've learned to try and find the opportunities in whatever's happening. And I think that this works for parents and teachers, and especially our students. I know for a fact that I'm going to be taking some Zoom or video conferencing terminology and taking it with me back to the classroom whenever we reopen. For students who struggle with conversation skills or, you know, the social pragmatics of taking turns, I'm going to be using mute and unmute yourself all the time. Because for certain students, when the social rules don't necessarily make sense, we need to come up with systems that we can teach them for how to navigate those situations. And I can't think of a better system than muting while someone else is talking and unmuting yourself whenever it's your turn to talk. And it's a visceral thing for them. They physically have to click the button right now. And so we can use opportunities like that to train these students for when we are back in person. This isn't just a time to maintain skills or just look for regression. It's also a time that we can definitely use to build skills. As far as including nonverbal students, I think that's largely where, like Nancy said, the assistive technology is going to come into play, and where finding those other opportunities like interactive polls, like clickables on the screen, or even ways that we can use kind of digital manipulatives for things is going to be really valuable for those nonverbal students when, you know, they can feel like they're getting lost in the shuffle with so many verbal students sharing back and forth.
I think that's good. We also have Leah Schramm, one of our other teachers, online, and she's been telling me all kind of ideas I should be sharing. One is there are, all of our internet providers have some mechanism for parents who are not able to afford or get the internet connectivity that they need for their child's education to call and get free or low cost. And I didn't realize that, and that's been wonderful for some of our families. So that's been really, really exciting. And I would definitely encourage you to do that. Leah, do you want to get on and share your other Anita Archer idea? If we can get into the unmute you.
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna try to hold it up, and I don't know if you can flip it or so you can see. And it's Leah Archer.
Leah, you know what? You're not. Your kids must be on Zoom.
I was actually just shared with me. It's a piece of paper, and students can make it. It says true, false, A, B, C, D, yes, no, and three.
Okay, Leah, great idea, but we can't get it because your internet isn't working well. So I don't know if your kids are doing school online. I'm going to get you to write up something and post it on our Facebook.
I don't know if you can see. Yeah, I know. There's too many people on my internet.
Yeah, that's what I was.
And then you see the paper.
Okay, Leah, you have to wait. It's
To
my auditory skills aren't good enough to follow that. Okay.
You can see the paper itself. You said a nonverbal student that gives the class
Just
the
Zoom is
multiple
slow too, I
students.
think.
Well, it's probably the worst time of the day. Everyone's getting on and trying to.
I actually have a 12:30 parent conference
Okay.
for my own.
If there are any questions that you feel like we did not get to, please email us, let us know. Nancy is going to make a copy of the recording available. We'll be glad to share it with you all. And hopefully this is going to move our kiddos a little bit further